And you shave. Before Tony says a few words, I want to make sure we all give him the credit that he is due. He has provided thoughtful policy leadership for NATOA. I think many in this room remember that he spearheaded our efforts to put together broadband principles about 8-9 years ago, I believe, and those still sustain us today. Here in Seattle, he worked on next generation network development, and he developed the strategic goal of the Seattle Task Force of Telecommunications Innovation. He has spoken at conferences at home and abroad on the social and economic benefits of fiber to the home, and he has served on the Federal Communications Commission's Advisory Committee on Diversity for Communications in the Digital Age. He is not done yet, because he has often said to the board, I will open a chapter of NATOA, the first international chapter in Cuba, and that is his next big step.
Thank you, Mike. All right. We're busy. I want to keep this short, and I'm also terribly embarrassed here, but honored at the same time. To me, it's the recognition and appreciation from your peers and colleagues. To me, is the finest distinction there is. So I'm thrilled and honored to accept this award, and I've been so honored too and fortunate in my career to work with so many outstanding, talented, and dedicated people who want to preserve and advance the public interest in communications. And I'm reminded every day that what we do really matters. And so that congratulations to all of you. Keep doing the work that we're doing, and I couldn't be prouder to receive this. Thank you.
And we have another award for this luncheon. I have the honor of presenting the Jane E. Lawton Commemorative Award. The Jane E. Lawton Award is presented annually to an elected official to recognize their years of extraordinary service on behalf of local governments and communities throughout the United States. It was created in memory of the Honorable Jane E. Lawton, who served as mayor of Chevy Chase, Maryland, delegate to the Maryland State House, and president of NATOA. Unfortunately, because of the storms that have happened in Texas, Florida, and Georgia and the East Coast, the recipient of this year's Jane E. Lawton Award is not able to be with us. The award goes to Mayor Gary Resnick of Wilton Manors, Florida, for his outstanding local and national leadership on communications policy and issues. Mayor Resnick was born in Newark, New Jersey. He has lived in Florida for many years and was elected to the Wilton Manors, Florida City Commission in 1998 and subsequently elected mayor and re-elected 5 times. I'm not going to read all the years. And because this is being web streamed, Gary, congratulations, and I'm going to keep giving the full description in case you're watching us either live or on demand. So I'll give Mr. Resnick a round of applause. Mayor Resnick served on NATOA's board of directors as chair of the FCC's Intergovernmental Advisory Committee and currently serves as vice chair of the National League of Cities Information Technology and Communications Committee. He has testified before Congress and the Florida State Legislature on broadband deployment and infrastructure siting policy, and is quick to share, those of you who know him, his extensive knowledge of telecom issues through his participation on many conference panels and webinars. I can't count the number of times that we have had very short notice and needed someone who knows the issues and is very articulate and is also an elected official. And he has been willing to travel to DC and testify on our behalf. Mayor Resnick very clearly personifies the qualities that the Jane E. Lawton Award recognizes: years of extraordinary service to local governments and communities across the country. And Mayor Resnick knew that he was not able to attend and has provided some comments for our Executive Director, Steve Traylor, will share those comments with us.
Well, I know the mayor was very upset that he couldn't make it today. Gary is not only a member of NATOA, but he's a good friend of mine, and I actually lived in Wilton Manors for a while, so he was actually my mayor. So it's kind of nice to be able to give some comments on his behalf. Thank you for this great honor. First, I am sorry I cannot be there in person. We did not know what Irma's impact would be. As it turns out, it looks like there was minor damage to Wilton Manors and much of Broward County, except for areas hit by tornadoes. Airports remain closed throughout Florida. Also, power is out throughout my community and Florida itself. In fact, it is reported that nearly 5 million meters, not persons, but meters, are without electricity. It seems that mainly areas that have underground utilities, and that's a big issue for Gary, and did not experience power outages. With temperatures in the high 80s and 90s, the lack of AC, refrigerators, and communications are serious. However, I want to thank NATOA for always being such a strong asset for local governments. I have valued and relied on the advice and input from NATOA staff and members for many years, and NATOA's representation on state and federal issues has been very important for our communities. Traditionally, many local officials did not focus on communications issues and tended to take those services for granted. However, everyone now realizes the importance of communications, not just for during times of emergencies like we've just experienced with Harvey and Irma, but in our day-to-day lives. I'm hearing now that many residents without power are raising issues with cell phones and internet being down. Cell phone service was out in my city Sunday night until about 11 a.m. Monday morning. It was not like the good old days with it was like the good old days without Facebook, texting, or social media. I hope NATOA can continue its advocacy for our communities, and I promise to continue to do what I can do to fight the good fight. Thank you for the honor of recognizing me with the Jane E. Lawton Award. I got to know Jane and admired her greatly. My family lives in Montgomery County. Residents there are fortunate that Jane set in place a great foundation for first-rate communication services. Thank you again.
And now our sponsor for our luncheon today, the CEO of CNX, Brian Mefford, is going to have the pleasure of introducing his friend, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you here again, and we're happy to have pitched in for lunch. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce my friend Jonathan Adelstein, and who's here to introduce, of course, to the world the iPhone X today. And wrong venue, I guess, but maybe later. But before I do that, actually, and I'm going to forego the sponsor prerogative of running the 5-minute CNX commercial. Everyone will be pleased to know that. But if you'll indulge me, I would like for our team who are here with us to stand. I see Terry and Sean here with us. I don't know if Angela's in the room. In the back. Thank you all. I know, like many of you, we certainly feel that our people are our best asset, and I think those of you who have spent time with these folks this week understand that and appreciate that. So I thank them for being here. Now's the segue to the introduction of Jonathan. But I'll first say, when we launched CNX, as some of you know, we did that because we saw a need to help bring resources together to create partnerships, true partnerships between communities and carriers and communications vendors and so forth And we saw that need and launched the company. And we knew part of the premise for that would be, again, the bringing together true partners. That's the reason that I was so pleased when Jonathan was appointed to lead up the Wireless Infrastructure Association, WIA, because in Jonathan, we have a partner and someone we can work with. And I'll tell you a bit in form of introduction why I say that, and Jonathan doesn't know what I'm going to say at this point, so he may be a bit nervous, but I'll share with you that it's not because, I don't say that because he's an artist, which he is. He's an accomplished musician, which I need to know more about in looking at your background. But it does. What we're doing and the things that we've been talking about here today and yesterday, this is as much about, it's a bit of art. It's as much art as it is science, really, in creating the solutions that need to be created. And Jonathan will continue to be a key leader in finding the right solutions to these problems, these challenges that we're all grappling with. I don't promote Jonathan in form of introduction today because, as we say in Kentucky, he's one smart fellow. But he is, and I'll hold back on going through the list of achievements and the time that he spent at some of our nation's finest institutions, including Stanford and Harvard, with multiple degrees. I don't promote Jonathan as a partner to you today because of the extensive time that he spent in government, though, in fact, he has 25 years, which is to be commended. 15 in Congress, I believe I have this right, 15 in Congress, 7 as a commissioner at the Federal Communications Commission, and then 3 at the USDA Rural Utility Service. We've been able to spend time at different points together, and I've watched Jonathan operate as part of government on the ground in communities, and it's something to behold. All of these things certainly contribute to his ability to work with you and be a partner. The thing, though, that I'm going to say that I've been most impressed by, and sort of is the attribute that I think that holds up to a true partnership is that he is a South Dakotan. And I'm not a South Dakotan, but what I have found over time is that South Dakota tends to produce a high degree of authenticity and practicality and pragmatism. And those are the qualities that Jonathan certainly possesses in spades. And those are the qualities as I listen to some of these conversations as I listen to these conversations that are happening in the rooms, there's a bit of eye rolling when we're saying partnership and collaboration, probably too much, and it sounds a bit hollow. But then ultimately, to really achieve those things, it requires basic sort of human elements like trust and practicality and pragmatism. And so with that, I want to commend Jonathan for being a leader in this industry, for possessing those attributes that, again, I believe will make him continue to put him in a leadership position to find these solutions. And again, as somebody that I promise that you can work with and trust. So with that, I'll introduce Jonathan Adelstein.
Wow, what an introduction. That was really over the top there. It reminds me of the time when I was on the FCC and I got this introduction. Somebody said I was a model commissioner. I was all excited. I went home and I told my wife about it. And then she looked it up in the dictionary. She said, model, a small replica of the real thing. Kind of put a damper on that. But thank you, Brian, for that. And thank you for welcoming me here to Seattle. I think it's appropriate that here in Seattle, we gave Tony Perez an award right off the bat. Tony, good job. Congratulations to you. Enjoyed working with you over the years. And Mayor Gary Resnick and I have testified in front of Congress together, and he was in the IAC when I was on the FCC, and I've known Gary for a long time, and nobody deserves it more than him. Such an honor. So if you're still watching the stream, Gary, way to go. Just don't give me a hard time at the hearing next time. I also especially like to thank my friend Steve Traylor, who we've worked with for many years, who's such a great leader for NATOA and has done such a good job. I go back to Libby. We all miss Libby, but Steve, you've done a fantastic job heading up this association, somebody can work with. We don't always agree, but nevertheless, you have such integrity and such a straightforward way of working. I think we've been able to make some progress together, and we'll talk about that a bit. You know, even if we don't always agree on policy matters, we share the same commitment to getting broadband out to communities and to do it in a way that respects, I think the community. And we want to make sure that your communities remain competitive, and so we work together with that in mind. And I'd like to thank all of you as who are here that are public servants. You know, Brian mentioned that I spent 25 years. I kind of understand where you're coming from, having been in that position for so long, and I think it helps. I mean, I worked hard with NATOA when I was in those positions and really had a lot of respect for what localities do as a fellow member of government. And now, you know, I see a lot of old friends here, and of course, in my new position, I see a lot of new enemies as well. So, but I still do have that feeling of rapport with you, because I know you're doing a lot of sacrifice, and you're doing a lot of that because you care about your communities, and you are the ones who want to get broadband out to your communities. You know, I wanted to, you know, say we sponsored the event today, and we managed to get the best sponsorship, which is, I think, this key, because we can't get in the row without you, and you can't get in your room without us. It's kind of like I'm propositioning each one of you, slipping you the key here, which is kind of what the industry has to do all the time. But for those of you who don't know the Wireless Infrastructure Association, we are representative of the providers that sometimes, you know, you love working with us, sometimes you don't, but you always manage to get the job done. We own, build, and operate the nation's wireless infrastructure, and our members are the carriers, some of whom are here today, the infrastructure owners, some of whom are here today, the professional service firms that help get the job done for us and operate and own telecom facilities around the country. And we advocate for the industry, as you know, on the federal level and the state level, and sometimes on the local level as well. What we promote is responsible deployment. We try to be advocate for that, and not just getting it done, but what we all want to do, and I know what you want to do, is to enable mobile broadband for your communities, just as our companies do. And I hope that we can get that done together. You might have met some of our staff. I think Zach presented yesterday. He had to run off, but Van Blois is here from our team. Van, are you? Where's Van? Right there. Now, so I hope you get a chance to say hi to Van if you haven't. I'm not authorized to say this, but I'm going to do it. Van, you might be mad at me, but it is his birthday today. The secret's out. Should we sing? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Van. Happy birthday to you. All right. So I'll be hearing about that for a while. Well, yeah, as I said, our industry has a very long and productive relationship working with all of you. And the idea that virtually every community, I say virtually because almost everyone, has gotten an approval before we put up every bit of infrastructure. Every macro tower, every small cell, every DAS system has been done in cooperation with you. And that's no small feat, because we have the world's greatest wireless infrastructure in the United States. All that with your approval. So we must be doing something right. We've worked together well, we've gotten the job done, and because industry and the localities have worked so well together, we built networks that are the envy of the world. It's not just, you know, here in the United States. I go overseas and people say, how did you do it in the United States? What is the trick? You know, they want to learn from us about what works and what doesn't. And a good example of that is the co-location model, which is that we fostered in the United States the idea that you don't need to put up an individual tower for each carrier that's doing it. You can put them on the same tower, and you can avoid tower farms. And it works well for the wireless industry. They might not have liked it at the beginning, but in the end, what it's fostered is a more efficient environment where they can actually save money. It's better for environmental protection. It's better for aesthetics. It's been good for the whole industry. And as a result, this shared infrastructure model is really the envy of the world. And what happens, for example, in Europe, where they have a rule in some countries, you go up to 50 meters by right, you end up with a situation that's not so pretty. I mean, here's what it looks like. And we've managed to avoid that. This is European, by the way, so none of my guys are implicated in this. But, if you don't have co-location, you can have that. So you've managed to encourage better design. You've managed to encourage us to share space whenever possible. And the practice of sharing space is also something that supports new entrants so they can come in and compete, and it supports innovation. So to those who say that we don't work well together, I say we do. I say the industry municipalities, I would repeat, have built the world's greatest wireless infrastructure, and we're about to do another big undertaking. And that's one of the reasons I'm here. We've been hearing a lot about it at this conference, but I think we need to continue to figure out ways to get that job done as we move on into 5G. So what we do is working with government at all levels, as I said, and the people in this hall right now really are the leaders in getting it done right. And I know people are grousing a bit about us complaining about some bad situations in some communities, and I know that probably it's not the people here that are doing that. You came out to this conference because you want to figure out how to do it right. You want to work with each other, work with us, and sometimes the best methods don't always get translated to every community. But most communities get it, and communities are increasingly getting it. We're finding the situation getting better in a lot of ways, not worse, as everybody's recognizing the ubiquity of this device, and it's kind of great for a lot of things, unless you have kids, in which case you pretty much lost them into this thing. And I feel a little guilty about that. I tell my kids that, it's really terrible for you, but it's good for business. So we'll go for unlimited bandwidth. Go for it. But our goal is to facilitate more efficient deployment of wireless infrastructure. We're facing a big challenge in making sure that we deal with those who are throwing up unreasonable barriers. So we're not talking about reasonable barriers, and the bills that we're talking about and the regulatory changes, we believe we're trying to deal only with the unreasonable. So it actually shouldn't impact a lot of the good actors that are doing their best. We want to raise up all communities to the level of sort of the best practices that a lot of the folks represented here are engaged in, that have welcomed broadband in your communities, that have tried to make it easier, that have gone through a lot of effort to streamline the process. And it makes sense that we do that together with NATOA going forward. We have a lot of work to do together, and we'd like to work as peers at sort of a national level to the degree we can, as discussions are going on at state level and at local level as well. A good example of the kind of roadblocks that we try to address is so-called Section 6409 that Congress enacted, which basically said that you don't have to do a new zoning every time you switch out equipment on a tower. I mean, that makes a lot of sense because it enables quicker co-locations. It, I think, really makes sense for everybody. Instead of fighting zoning battles that have already been established, you could deal with the permitting, but you don't have to rezone a tower that's already been zoned. It'd be like having a little building and you're changing out the tenant, and you rezone it just because they're changing out the tenant. It made no sense. As a matter of fact, it was, I think, such an unreasonable practice that Congress banned it. Now, it's not easy to get Congress to act on a bipartisan basis to do anything, so you know that there's something to it. But, NATOA and WI worked together well to get that implemented. At the request of the FCC, Steve and our team went out on the road and kind of discussed how to implement that. So we were able to work together on that kind of things, and that's what we're focused on. It's not just every barrier, but just those that are really causing issues. And, we spend a lot of time working on state legislatures around the country, and you've been hearing a lot about that already today and more to come on these bills that are designed to streamline broadband deployment, particularly as small cells become more and more ubiquitous. And I'll get into that in a minute. And our goal is to make sure that we get better wireless services to communities around the country. As our kids and everybody else are ramping up, we need to make sure that we address the demand of the consumer. And I know that some of you feel that we're pressing on too many fronts at once, and that there's sort of multiple venues where this issue is being debated. And my response is that lawmakers are asking us, how can we help? The FCC actually comes to us and says, what can we do to make your job easier to deploy? States, Congress, the FCC, the White House has put on executive order. The last White House put out executive order saying, what can we do to streamline the process? So policymakers at a federal level and a state level and many on a local level are trying to help us. And it makes sense for us to say, well, here's some of the issues that we run into. And I don't say we run into them in every community, and I'm repeating that here, but in those that we do, we need to deal with it. I'm personally serving on the FCC's BDAC, the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, with Brian and others. I'm chairing the one on streamlining federal siting, which isn't as much of a concern to people here. But I think BDAC is one forum for industry to come together with municipalities. I know there's been concern about how it's been structured, but if we're not happy with the structure there or the representation, if we can use that for a forum for more dialogue, even if it's outside of the BDAC, we have working groups or whatever to talk about how to come up, particularly with model codes. Because if we come up with a model municipal code or a model state law and there's no buy-in from states or municipalities, it just sits on the shelf and it doesn't get implemented. It doesn't do anybody any good. So we're not looking for something that's just sort of an industry model that we impose, because that's not the way America works. And so we might need to be creative, but if we can find ways to come up with actionable items, I think we should do it. We're really a facilitator at WIA for some of the smartest people in the industry to figure out how to solve these problems. We have a thing called the Innovation and Technology Council that we have some folks here who work on that. We have an independent developers forum that goes out and tries to build facilities in local communities. So we try to provide thought leadership. If you go on our website, you'll see some things that might help you understand a little bit better about the technology and small cells. I'll get into some of that here today, but we do white papers and things to make sure that you know what you're doing. And we have some great industry events too. I've seen some of you at them. We have one coming up in Florida. Anybody here from Florida? Some people made it out. Our hearts are with you. You know what's happened out there. We're glad you could make it out. And Texas too. Such a devastation. But we're going to Florida next month to West Palm, which was largely spared. So we're going to show our support by showing up down there. And I'd like to invite all of you down there as my guest. We'll, of course, comp you. We'd love to have more local officials represented. If you want to learn more about small cells and get ahead of the process, let me know, and I'll make sure you could get registered down there and down in Palm Beach at the convention center, which is doing fine, thank goodness. And that'll be where we'll really talk about the ongoing densification. We'll be having similar panels to what you're having here, with slightly different, maybe one municipality and 3 industry as opposed to the other way around. And but you'll hear what's going on. And we also have a supplier diversity summit that we hold. We're trying to increase the diversity of our industry. More women-owned, minority-owned, veteran-owned businesses. We bring them together with the industry to have a matchmaking service. And we also have state wireless associations some of you might have gotten involved with that hopefully you'll participate with as well. So we're trying to develop better mobile networks. A lot of you probably know this, but just to sort of level set, I mean, there's the towers that really provide the broad umbrella coverage, and for most of the time in the United States, they provided the vast bulk of the coverage, and they still do today. In urban areas where we can't necessarily put a tower up, we use rooftop installations that are like a tower in a dense urban area. And now you're seeing the rise of small cells, which we've been predicting for a while, but you're really starting to see, I think, larger numbers of them quickly coming to the fore. And, as we get into that, basically towers are a much more efficient way to do this. It's frankly cheaper, it gets the job done, but there's so much demand, which I'll get into in a minute, that the amount on the towers can't necessarily keep up. So in spot areas, we'll put in a small cell to deal with more capacity than coverage. And generally it starts in urban and works its way out because of the expense. If you could put up a tower, you'll do that instead. But where the tower can't meet the capacity needs, it's being supplemented by these small cells, particularly in dense areas like a stadium, or we'll have a distributed antenna system that we put within one of these facilities. Now, I think a lot of people probably assume here that wireless companies have deep pockets, and these are large companies that are profitable, but I'm really here to talk about it. Not many people will do this, but it's not an easy situation right now. If you're watching TV at all, you see the ads with the chainsaws and the unlimited plans and the cheaper prices. They're competing on price so much that in the last year, the actual CPI of the United States has dropped solely because of a 13% drop in the price of wireless service. So while you're seeing wireless service prices drop, You're seeing unlimited plans go out, and you're seeing usage go up dramatically. So my carrier members are really in a squeeze, believe it or not. They're not having the same kind of situation in terms of their stock price or their margins. They actually are seeing their average revenue per user go down at a time when usage is going up rapidly. They're not like Facebook and Google, which is basically minting money on the backs of these networks that our members have to invest $30 billion a year to make. So it's challenging in the middle of a price war to have to build all of this infrastructure to keep up with demand. And consumers are the winners. They're getting more bandwidth for less money. There's no two ways around it. So how do we prepare for a massive 5G build-out at a time when our wireless companies are getting squeezed in their margins and their average revenue per user, and at the same time they're competing on quality? So they're saying, we have a better network. No, we have a better network. Well, this is how you get a better network, is building out more of this infrastructure, and it's extremely expensive. So you can see why creating a predictable business environment helps the wireless industry deploy these networks. It's tough for a company to make these big investments without knowing that the rules are where they are and they're not going to change. And we just can't afford to waste a lot of time and money on unreasonable regulations, or somebody won't get served. Capital kind of flows like water, and those communities that throw up resistance, unless they're really big and we have to serve them, money tends to go somewhere else. The investment tends to go somewhere else. $30 billion a year is a huge investment, bigger than any other industry, but it's frankly not enough to keep up with this incredible demand. So the smart communities are getting it. They're rolling out the red carpet to encourage investment in broadband for their citizens. And a lot of those smart communities represented right here, as I've said. Yet there's still some communities that look at wireless infrastructure industry as an adversary, as a source of revenue rather than somebody that they need to work with to serve their consumers. And those are the reasons that we are out there on some of these regulatory struggles on the other side of the table from all of you. But our job ultimately is to make sure that the wireless industry and all levels of government work well together. That way we can roll out most efficiently to where it's needed, and not on the basis of where there's regulatory ease in getting deployment, but where the consumers are. It's not just the community that gets punished when a locality throws up too many roadblocks or makes it too difficult to deploy. The carrier does too, because they went to that community first because that's where they wanted to put it. That's where they saw the need. But sometimes they'll go around that because they don't have the time or money to be held up. And we'd like to level that playing field and make it more uniform. You all know, I think, what wireless service does. I'm not going to belabor how important this is, but whether it's your own service of government to citizens that are doing it on their wireless device, the overall economic development, an area that I used to work a lot with, where rural areas begged us to get broadband out there because they knew that their young people wouldn't stay without it. And it's the same even in urban areas that don't have adequate capacity. And the ongoing effort to create smarter communities by leveraging mobile communications and the Internet of Things all require this type of infrastructure investment that we're doing. So much business today relies on wireless connectivity, not just from governments, account executives, software engineers, home builders, running from project to project. I mean, everybody depends on mobile broadband, or the work just doesn't get done. And emergency services too. When you think about what's happening in Florida and Texas, we want to make sure that those networks are there and that they're there when they're needed. So if you want smart cities, you have to have smart regulation. And smart communities can transform the way that we live and work, and access to 5G is going to be critical to that. Now, even today, long before 5G, we're seeing this increase. Basically, 500% is the prediction. You've heard this before probably, in the amount of data that consumers are going to be using over the next 5 years, 35% a year on average of data growth. So how do you keep up with that? Smartphones are accounting for that, the video, but the number of machine-to-machine connections is starting to increase dramatically at the same time. And that growth could lead to what I call wireless data crunch. You used to hear about a spectrum crunch, but it's not just spectrum that allows for more bandwidth. There's basically 3 dials, I like to call them as a musician. These are my old Fender amp here. 3 dials you can turn up to get more bandwidth. And down in San Francisco at Mobile World Congress, they talked a lot about spectrum today. more spectrum, more throughput. Well, as I once said, God isn't creating any more spectrum. I mean, there is a severe shortage of it. It's hard to get more. You got to pry it out of the hands of DoD. Good luck with that. It's just extremely expensive and limited. We can't get enough of it, and we're trying. Technology is, for example, going from 3G to 4G is more efficient, from 4G to 5G is more efficient. But on average, we get 10 to 15% increase a year in efficiency through technology, and yet you're looking at 35% growth a year, 500% over years. So how do you make up the difference? If you're not getting more spectrum, technology efficiency isn't keeping up. It's really that third dial infrastructure that is the reason we're hearing so much about this, and the reason that you're under so much pressure to try to help us from policymakers. They're getting it, but infrastructure takes time, and it's not cheap either. So we need all of these things. We need spectrum. We need more technology to move quickly. We need more infrastructure. But the observation that we need more infrastructure has really been validated. There's one chart I want you to kind of think about when you go home. It's this one from Moffett-Nathanson. Spectrum reuse is basically more infrastructure. The more pieces you put in, and I'll kind of explain this in a bit, the more you can use it. So you look over the last 45 years at what has created a millionfold improvement in the usage of in the wireless capacity of this country. And the vast bulk, 1,600 versus 25 for spectrum, 25 for technology, has been infrastructure. So this is nothing new. Even though we've heard a lot about these other things, it's really been just the gut work of building these towers and building out other types of wireless facilities on rights of way that have delivered the vast bulk of the capacity that we all benefit from today. And Moffett-Nathanson, if you go on and read their report, does not see this changing going forward. So that's why we've seen the shift in the discussion about infrastructure, and we changed our name just in time. We used to be PCIA, but now we're the Wireless Infrastructure Association. We definitely saw this coming. But what we do, because there's not enough spectrum, you've heard about densification. And basically network densification is how do you get more out of the existing spectrum? So if you have a number of cell sites, these are different cell sites, each one might have a tower in the middle of it, and you have all of the, say you're at one frequency and you have everything going into one tower in the middle of that square, you end up with, and then you build out other sites around it, you increase the use of that same spectrum. It's called cell splitting, spectrum reuse. It's happened in the tower industry where you don't necessarily have to build a new tower, but what we found is that existing towers are filling up with new tenants. So you might have had one or two, T-Mobile and an AT&T on one, and all of a sudden Sprint or Verizon will come on that one, and they're filling up because of the demand for those, which has been very good for the tower industry. And as those fill up and there's more demand for capacity, we continue to cell split with these small cells so that you can reuse the limited frequencies that we have. And take that chart and just start dividing more and more and more. And that's the problem that you're all facing, which is you're getting inundated already in some cases, and you will be in other cases with applications to put up a whole bunch of small cells. And believe me, it's the last thing that the industry wants to do is spend that much money on those, but there's no alternative because there's not enough spectrum and the technology is not keeping up with it. So we need to reuse the spectrum that we have today. And imagine when you get tens of billions of new devices, which Nokia has predicted, coming online to communicate with each other machine to machine, we need a massive increase in the number of cell sites. And that's been good for making more devices, more antennas on cell towers, more devices on poles, more antennas of all sizes and shapes on all different kinds of structures. Because the data transmitted from the car to the traffic light or from the pedestrian to the car doesn't work unless there's wireless infrastructure to connect it. So we need a lot more of that for the massive amount of information that's coming. And we're on the precipice of this 5G evolution that you all have been hearing about. And the goal for carriers and for the companies that support them is rapid commercialization of this 5G technology. They're preparing now in 4G. So when they build out these more dense networks and more nodes and small cells for 4G, and they're building fiber to them, it's because they know that that's going to allow them to rapidly put up 5G when the time comes and not have to go through the slow process of building out those dense networks. Plus, under 4G, we're already meeting capacity limits in a number of dense areas. And when you think about the design of these networks, it's very specific. As you get to a small cell, they need to go exactly where the carrier needs them because they're trying to pinpoint. So you can't kind of tell them, well, you need to go over there, try to dictate a lot of design issues because that can increase cost dramatically, make it very difficult to get the job done. Again, you know, all this is aimed at our shared goal. I think we all want to deliver mobile broadband access to the people in your communities, and we need to work together to do it. Even as these laws pass, there's still a major role for localities in terms of permitting, even if some of it's streamlined in terms of zoning, in terms of safety and all those issues that go with the permitting. So, you know, we are committed to connectivity to everyone, everywhere. We want to make sure that all towns and cities are connected and ubiquitously. It's been a real mission of mine since I was at the FCC years ago, you know, to do this, and I've been really privileged to find a job in industry where we can continue that effort. And as I've worked with you well throughout those days, I'm hoping we can continue, and we have been able to continue to work well together to try to figure out how we get this done. I'm not sure that all communities have realized how high the stakes are. I really think as I talk to people here, you do realize it. You might not agree with how we're going about it as an industry, but we want to figure out how we can really reach out and smooth off those rough edges and work with all of you. I come out here to kind of explain the challenges that we're facing so you understand our perspective, and I come here to hear your frustrations about what it is that we're trying to do as we're trying to take advantage of these policymakers. I think they've had sort of an aha moment, you know, at state, local levels, federal levels, that they see what's going on with these devices. I wish I was unveiling the new iPhone here. I got my old one, but running down to San Francisco to get a new one tomorrow. But we all have to work together to address this wireless data crunch I talked about. You don't want that in your communities. We don't want that for our customers. So from towers to small cells to distributed antenna systems, we need to work with you on an environment where we can get these things deployed as efficiently and effectively as possible, meeting your real needs, but making sure that your communities can reap all the benefits of wireless broadband. So thank you for having me out in Seattle. I very much appreciate it. And I'm happy to take questions, brickbats, food, anything. More chocolate. If you're not eating your chocolate, I'll take that.
Thank you very much for being here. I'm Lori Sherwood with Broadband Director for Vantage Point Solutions. And with all the focus on 5G and infrastructure and what we're doing in our bigger cities, what is your focus with the rural communities to make sure they don't get even left further behind? I was doing a project in the Southwest, rural Southwest, where they barely even have 3G. You can't get service. It's a public safety matter. It's a big concern for our communities that are still struggling to get up into the 20th century in terms of what they have for wireless infrastructure.
Well, it's a great question. You know, we don't even have 4G everywhere, even in rural areas in particular, but even in some more urbanized areas. So to think that 5G is going to come overnight to rural America, it really isn't that realistic. And I'm not here to, you know, sell you some swampland. It's tough. I mean, we talked about these financial strains that the industry is under and the difficulty. One of the questions for the industry is, what is the business case on 5G, and how much marginal revenue do you generate relative to the massive amount of investment that you have to make? And there's different assessments of it, but it's not clear yet. I mean, you know, the Internet of Things is something people hope is going to drive a lot of revenue, but I think it's probably realistic to say that 5G goes to the most dense areas first, because the increase in efficiency that I talked about from 5G is most needed where there's a capacity crunch, and the capacity crunch is happening in much more dense areas. A lot of times it happens in suburban areas as well because it's so hard to site towers out there. So one thing to make it easier is if, you know, frankly, people let it make it easier for industry to deploy the appropriate type of technology. If we need a tower there, sometimes people say, well, why don't you put small cells in so we can't see it? But then that costs a lot more. And sometimes the industry will suck it up and do it. Sometimes the community will suffer. But the less we have sort of, at least from this group's perspective, regulatory drag, the more revenue is left over, more CapEx, because it's kind of a limited CapEx budget. And the more gets sort of sucked up in urban, the less there is for rural. Rural is less of a regulatory challenge, I think, than it is an economic one. We don't tend to have the resistance as much in rural areas that kind of beg people to come in, unless they're really super high-end areas, and then you get people complaining about, oh no, we can't have that in our little yacht community. But other than those, I mean, rural America is very welcoming in terms of regulatory. Yeah. There you go. Oh, over there. Sorry, we're going to switch off.
Yeah,
Hey,
we're switching.
all the way from D.C. area.
Hi, Commissioner Adelstein, Mitzi Herrera from Montgomery County. I know you and I had this conversation, but I wanted to ask you here. From a local government perspective, we do not regulate on the basis of RF, but residents' concerns about radio frequency emissions drives a significant amount of their anxiety about having small cell deployments. We have FCC rules that haven't been updated since 1996. The GAO went and asked them to look at it because people use their cell phones much differently than they did. And people look and they have concerns that we don't test these on children, we don't test them on women, and yet you want to put them 35 feet from my daughter's bedroom. And one of the best things that could happen is that the FCC opened up a proceeding in 2013 to update those rules. And over the past 4 years, they have not done so. So what I wanted to ask you is whether WIA and some other industry, and particularly Republican members of Congress, can come and speak with the chairman and other commissioners to urge them as part of BDEC, a part of those rules, and as our county executive said before that, to actually move and complete that proceeding and update those rules so that more Americans will feel that they are safe, that they are at good distances from that. And that gap in their comfort level drives a significant amount of the opposition, and I think we really need to address that. So I'm asking you, will you help us address that with the FCC?
The answer is yes. I mean, I think it's a great area for us to work together with NTOA. I think the FCC does need to update those rules. I think that people have legitimate concerns because it hasn't been updated. I'm not sure that the science has changed, but we are not going to advocate necessarily one position or the other. Let the science dictate it. Be as strong as you want. The last thing the industry wants is any negative health effects. And we think the handsets are totally safe, but when it comes to the equipment that we kind of focus on at WIA, if a worker does get too close to them, it could be an issue, and there are limits because they're much higher power. And there was a panel earlier today that talked about this a little bit. We need to make sure we keep every single worker safe, not just because that's a deep commitment of this industry, but imagine the negative consequences if anybody has an issue in raising even more unfounded concerns about it, because it's not comparable to the handsets that people are exposed to on a regular basis. So we would defer to the FCC on what the rules are, but just do it. Make them as stringent as you want, make sure everybody's safe, and we will adhere to it, but get it done. We absolutely support that, and we should work with you and NTOA on that.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here and helping, us better understand your industry's position. And I was curious about a comment that you made in your comments, and that was when you talked about your adversaries and the local governments who want to make money off of their, assets or their rights-of-way. So I would like you to elaborate a little bit more on that, because I've heard that several times from industry, and I'm not quite understanding how local governments, are positioned to make money off of that, in the sense that the money that usually is generated from local, commercial use of our assets goes to fund, public safety and parks and, those kinds of things, as well as our regulation and oversight for the public good of use of those assets.
Well, great question. Let me talk about the rights of way versus non-rights of way. I mean, the rights of way are operated sort of for the public benefit by municipalities, and there's really not a lot of alternatives for industry but to use those for this new small cell technology. And some communities have been very reasonable about pricing in order to get cost recovery for their costs of managing the rights of way, and others have tried to use it. Now, I understand that if a government gets that revenue, that they could use that for very good purposes. Having been there and worked on the budget myself for many years at the federal level, all kinds of great purposes for those funds, but I think they're better raised through general tax. Question is, if you're going to use this as a source of revenue beyond the cost of regulating and managing the rights of way, then you're basically, as I talked about, putting a tax on one of the most valuable resources that the community has, which is broadband. And broadband is also used for public safety. It's used for for emergency services. It's used for people that are dialing 911. It's used for their education, their culture, their health care, all those things that communities care about. So that, in my view, maybe to step back, in my days as studying economics, it's called externalities. That externalities in economics are benefits of a product that don't flow to the company that provides them, but flow to other aspects of the economy or the society. Externalities are huge in broadband. The AT&Ts of the world don't necessarily benefit from the person who avoids having to have surgery because they were able to be monitored by a healthcare device. They get whatever profit they get from their very competitive pricing vis-a-vis their competitors. But the society benefits. The person doesn't have to telecommute, so there's not more pollution in the air that makes everybody else sick because they could telecommute because they had wireless service. The economic development, I've gone on and on, I went on it today, all those benefits. So if you're going to tax something, and it's essentially like a tax, if you're using it not just for managing the right of way, don't tax broadband. Come up with, there's a lot of other things I could think of. I'm not going to suggest it, but things that you could tax that might be less healthy, that might lead people to need their 911 call, And I know it's tough because sometimes that goes to the consumer and then politically it's unpopular. So localities are strapped for cash because of the political difficulty of raising revenue through other means, and then they use this as, and it's not all communities that do it. Again, I'm talking about the extreme examples of very high fees that are charged. I mean, reasonable fees, cost recovery is something that, makes a lot of sense. And that's something that's getting negotiated on a state by state level, and it's something that we haven't gotten engaged in as WIA very directly. That's something that the carriers have really negotiated directly with the League of Municipalities or local government representatives in the states. But you can stand up for yourselves and say that here's what these costs are and here's what we need, so it doesn't get unreasonable. But when it's certain, you've heard some of these prices that get charged, and again, it's not a universal problem. It's some communities that cause a problem, and then the industry goes in and everybody gets upset because you feel like we're tarring everybody with the same brush. I mean, we're trying not to. I mean, I get it that a lot of communities are very reasonable about this, and hopefully they wouldn't be as affected by those limits on prices. Yes.
Commissioner, a couple of things. One, thank you very much for the commitment on trying to approach the commission in a collective manner on RF. We think that would move things along. Secondly, I'd like to thank you for the honesty of your presentation. I think you've been a terrific ambassador for your industry, as has Van, on a regular basis. I guess I have a question for you. We can argue whether there's 12 states or 13 states that have passed these laws. My question is, if I'm representing a local government, do I tell them to negotiate a franchise today only to have that franchise, the terms of that overturned by state legislation? I mean, we heard an example. We were sitting next to each other when San Antonio was praised as being a very, very open and efficient and logical and productive discussion. And my question would be, okay, company XYZ, you said all those nice things about San Antonio. Are you going to honor that agreement, or are you going to take the SB 1004, the Texas state law terms? And so my question is, if you're in a state that hasn't passed the law, does it make sense to negotiate? Or maybe WIA and local government can agree that we have a safe harbor for any agreements that have been negotiated so that we don't have a delaying factor, we don't have a retarding factor, because I think right now a lot of folks are wondering, why do I negotiate this if the terms are going to be rewritten by the state legislature or possibly the FCC?
Yeah, I think that would be a fair issue for a negotiation in a state legislature. Say we have an existing agreement in place, and are you going to grandfather that essentially? I mean, I'm not saying we'd support that necessarily, but that might be a reasonable argument that you could make to a state legislator. In answer to your basic question, I'd say yes, you should do both, because we never know if a state law is going to pass, for one thing. We need to get broadband to your community, whether or not a state passes a law. And if you're concerned about that, and again, a place to look at that, I think, is inside and outside of the right-of-way. Because if they agree that these laws apply outside of the right-of-way, that really is something you need to kind of think about. If you have a facilities outside of the right-of-way, is that the same as inside of the right-of-way? A lot of the focus has been inside, but it's something I think you could think about very carefully as you look at these laws. So these are issues up for negotiation on a state-by-state basis as these things are getting called out. And I think you've kind of seen the playbook now, you know, and to think about as an industry, how do you negotiate with the state legislature vis-a-vis us, because we're having many venues where we're negotiating. We're negotiating the FCC, we've got state legislatures, we've got individual deals that are being worked out community by community, and we can't really afford to wait. So we like to work all of these at once. I know that puts sometimes us in a difficult position, and it can seem unfair, but you can hardly blame us for trying to work with policymakers who are really open to try to promote wireless broadband when they offer to help, not taking them up on that.
Thanks.
I had a quick question. You may have answered it a couple of questions ago, but there's been a lot of discussion about, you know, what's a reasonable fee, what's not a reasonable fee, and cost recovery is something that seems to be a fair medium in there. Do you know where the wireless industry came up with the figures for using the right-of-way or for using city infrastructure in the right-of-way, and the basis for the number they've given? And the reason I ask is, for example, in Arizona, the original legislation was $20, and that was the quote reset that the industry demanded was the fee that was appropriate.
Well, I think, you know, they're probably trying to start as cheaply as they can, and then it ends up being a subject of negotiation on a state-by-state level. I'm not sure there's an objective basis for it, except for what maybe it might cost to process. But if there's better evidence that it's a higher cost recovery, I mean, if you think about it, it kind of helps the industry if there is cost recovery, that the locality has the resources then to process the number of applications that are going through. It'd be kind of self-defeating if we end up not allowing you to have the resources you need to process this amount of work that you have coming your way. So that is, again, a legitimate topic for discussion sort of in these state legislatures as we go into the next cycle. There will be a lot more states. We've had whatever a dozen so far that have enacted laws, and there'll be a lot more that are in the hopper next year, and that's fair game for negotiation right there.
Thank you.
Oh, here comes Ken. He should be in a good mood because the Broncos won, so.
He's in a great mood. A couple of things. For a comment and then a question. I know we have a lot of first-time attendees at NATOA this year, and some of us have been coming back here for well past 20 years. So for the people who don't know, even though we do disagree, and we've joked about this, but I just want to give you a shout out here publicly. We have somebody who will sit and listen to us seriously here and respects our concerns, even when we don't agree. So I thank you, and I thank you for your leadership at WIA and for coming to NATOA and continuing the conversation. So we appreciate that.
Thanks, Ken.
Something that you said a few minutes ago addressing the rural issue and the economic issue struck me, that maybe there's another way that we can work together and show that when it makes sense to collaborate, there's a way that industry and local government can do that. We know that as an organization, WIA does not control what your individual members do any more, frankly, than NATOA does. But we also know that as a national association, sometimes if some of our members are getting a little wacky, we try to have a nice little way to influence them so as not to screw up the bigger national discussion. So without telling you what I think you ought to do as far as advocating amongst your members, we've got a lot of state laws that restrict local governments from being able to themselves finance and promote rural broadband. And when there have been discussions in those states to either not have those laws or ease up on those laws, it's just sort of a natural reaction, and I get it. It's within these companies' institutional DNA to say, no, we don't want the government competing with the private sector. But it may make sense when you know that at that base economic level, there's just not an economic model that works for a lot of your members to get to rural Colorado or get to rural South Dakota or get onto the Native American reservations and provide the kind of service that would get even a little bit close with leveling the playing field with the urban and suburban areas. That may be some kind of push from the national associations, and I don't just mean WIA, but you're here, to your members that, you know, when that comes up in North Carolina or Colorado or wherever it might be, maybe you guys should just back off and say, yeah, it makes sense to let local governments get in the game here, at least where we know we're not going there and are going to be spending some of those billions of dollars in deployment. So maybe that's another area where we can continue to have this discussion about collaborating, because frankly, if you get more government money, more funding from state departments of local affairs or rural development, I mean, hell, you did this at RUS, then there are some of your members who might benefit from that, because now you've got government helping them subsidize the cost of extending service into these hard-to-reach areas. Just a thought.
Well, it's an interesting thought. You know, Steve will get this, but when you run a trade association, you have a thing called conflicts. You know, some people feel one way, and some people, and we have some members that really think it's a bad idea to compete against government. Others probably would welcome exactly what you're talking about, but because of that, we kind of stay out of it. So I don't support those laws, but I don't fight them either. You know, we just kind of stay out of that whole battle. I don't know. I don't see a resolution of that conflict anytime soon, unfortunately. But when I was at RES, we financed some localities that wanted to provide that kind of service, and sometimes it's, you know, can be helpful to the community. But there's the other side of, you know, government competing against the private sector. Then the other side goes, well, that's how you get competition going and get what happens sometimes when we do that is actually then the government goes in, and then the private sector. This happened to me at RUS. The government goes in, then the private sector gets all worked up and goes in. And then they undercut the government that started it out, which is good for the community, but the government ends up holding the bag a little bit. So it's a danger of having actual success in terms of the purse of the locality that financed that. Complicated issue, but I think we're stuck in the middle, essentially. Yeah.
So I wanted to echo one is Ken's sentiment of thank you for coming and thank you for engaging, I think, in a respectful and honest dialogue. But I wanted to sort of push back on the comments that you had made just earlier about the contributions to local government from these agreements. In Montgomery County, which is 500 square miles and adjacent to Washington, D.C., there's 1 million people, and a third of the county is a rural agricultural reserve. When mobility came into the county and wanted to put in 117 new towers, none of those were in the rural area of the county. Crown Castle has come in and concentrated 100 poles in 3 different neighborhoods in which they are very high dollar value homes. Verizon has come in and they want to go into downtown Silver Spring, where the county has invested money in transit, preserving some landmarks, creating a civic and encouraging new zoning so that you have these work-play communities. In the local government, I help fund a program now in which we teach older adults to use technology. And we think that that is a key to the healthcare, is having people who are uncomfortable in your target group be able to be comfortable with that. We fund free Wi-Fi in libraries. We fund broadband for schools, and we fund broadband for public safety communications, as well as all the government. So why should an industry that comes into a community that doesn't have an obligation to serve everyone, that leverages the investment that we've made to have these densely populated communities, why shouldn't they have to provide more than just at-cost support to support all those other, particularly broadband-related programs that the entire community is funding? Why should this one industry get the benefit of being able to selectively serve and not have to pay for that?
Okay, so is that something I've thought about a lot, because over the years that I'm working with you on cable franchising, working with NATOA back in, what was 06, 07, we talked a lot about that. And let's compare the cable franchise situation where you have a monopoly provider essentially getting a franchise to provide a very lucrative service to the community.
We have three cable providers in Montgomery County, 15 wireline providers and 4 wireless carriers. Verizon and Comcast compete head-to-head through the bulk of Montgomery County.
You're very lucky, and you must have managed that well, because some communities don't have Verizon Fios there because they asked for too much. And so Verizon Fios said, we're not going to go. And the locality said, I don't believe you, you're going to have to come here eventually. So if you're in Alexandria, where I live, you don't get Fios. If you're in Arlington, where I live, in a very nice part of this city, I get it. So either nobody gets it or some people get it. Is it fair? It's a very, very competitive environment for wireless, as I've noted. And I think all of you who watch television or see the ads know what's going on. But if you actually look at the financial analysts, it's brutal. I mean, they're cutthroat price competition, and they are not like the cable guys who could make those kind of deals. And if these are very worthy causes, and if you roll back the tape, I think all the things you're talking about are extremely worthy of government funding. Question is, where does it come from? Does it come from the broad tax base? And of course, you have a very good tax base in Montgomery County, fortunately for you. Some places don't have as good of a tax base, but you've got to squeeze out the best you can with that. I don't think you want to put that on the wireless companies, not just because I represent them. I'm talking about it really from the perspective of the externalities I talked about, that you want that wireless broadband. And if you put up too much of that and you demand too much of that redistribution from that company in particular, you run a serious risk of either being delayed temporarily or for a longer period. What happened in the case of Fios is that they're never coming back to some of these communities they didn't go to. It might be a different situation, but Cambridge, Massachusetts, doesn't have it, but Boston does because of what Cambridge asked for. Now Cambridge is begging; they would love to have Fios, but they're not. The money's gone, And I hope that we are always able to invest $30 billion a year, and that this industry's, successful going forward. But it's not anything like some of the companies that are benefiting from those wireless networks, like the Googles and the Facebook of the world, whose average revenue per user goes up, whose ads go up, whose profits go up, whose market cap goes up. You look at AT&T and Verizon, they're pretty flat over the last 10 years. And yet they're the ones who are providing the $30 billion investment in infrastructure that's making all those other companies worth, Apple, $700 billion, and $1,000 phone coming out tomorrow, all because the $1,000 phone isn't worth anything more than a brick if it doesn't work on a network that gives it all that wonderful functionality. So, and a lot of people in your community of all are be able to afford that phone more than most places, and they want to have really hot, fast service when they're away from their Wi-Fi at home. So do you want to use that service to fund all the other good things you're talking about? I just don't think so.
Well, let me just ask you just a short follow-up. What about the concept that if you do charge, it gives you the ability to say that in the rural area in Montgomery County, we could say that there's no fee. And in the urban area where you have the most competition, so you essentially have market-based pricing, and you use that pricing as a way to help level the playing field, because you're going to get fewer customers in the dense area, but I'm going to lower those costs, and which I noticed those costs are fully passed through onto they're line itemized on the bills for subscribers. So if all the carriers are paying the same ones, they're all in an equal footing.
They're not line item, though. I mean, those charges are generally not line item on the bill. I mean, they're basically absorbed by the company one way or the other. It's cost of doing business. So they can't sort of pass it through, particularly in this very competitive environment. I mean, you can try that as a strategy to try to get, and I think if you're in a rural area and you want investment, you better go bottom line on the prices. And if you're in sort of dense suburban Montgomery County, you have a little bit more leverage, because you have very good customers that people want. In dense areas, you have more leverage. But the question is, how much leverage do you have? And what I'm saying here is it might not be as much as you think, because the money is very, very tight. The demand is enormous. And the ability to cover everybody that needs it is limited. So if you throw up too many roadblocks in one way or the other, price is one, there is a real chance that you get moved back in line. I'm not saying you'll never get it like Fios, but it's probably not a great strategy. It's a risky strategy.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
We've heard a lot of talk about how there's a minority of jurisdictions that are causing certain unreasonable barriers. But if you read the filings in a lot of the FCC proceedings, it seems like there's a plurality of jurisdictions that are causing these issues. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they're unnamed, and so they can't defend themselves or verify these facts. So does WIA have a position on this kind of approach in these filings? Are you encouraging your members to name them? And if so, or if not, why?
Well, we leave it up to them to do it. The reason that they don't like to name them is they have to go back to them again and again and again. And, you guys hold the key, literally, going back to my sponsorship, to the success of these companies. And so you don't want to beat up, the hand that feeds you, essentially, even if you're not happy with it. So that's why the anonymity. It's not being sneaky or anything. It's an actual concern about getting punished, later for something. And all these things are real. We never put anything in that's not a real example, but sometimes they're not named for that reason. We certainly don't tell our members, to name something that they don't want to name because they're concerned about a backlash or repercussions.
Okay, thanks.
Commissioner, how can we document that it's not made up if we don't know the name of the community so the community can tell the other side of the story?
Well, I mean, we would never, in front of the FCC, I would never put something that we hadn't seen as a verified, situation. But I understand your point there.
If you could take just one last question. Thanks.
I know it's short time, but I was wondering if you could talk about a little bit about the privacy concern of citizens, government's right to get information about people. Hope this is a good question.
It's an area that we don't work a lot on in WIA because it's sort of what we focus on the infrastructure side and not sort of the applications that ride over it. So it's an issue more for our carrier members, but they deal with that largely through CTIA, that is their lobbying force for the privacy issues, which are really complex. And I don't want to step on anything because I don't sort of study it day to day. So it's just not an area that I focus on right now in this job, I'm sorry to say. But. All right, thanks everybody, appreciate it.
I really have to thank Jonathan Adelstein for coming here today to speak with you all. As I've told you before, I have two bosses, and they are keeping me on time. So this session was over now, but let me just do some quick bookkeeping announcements. There is still space available on tomorrow's King County Seattle station tours. Just go to the registration desk and please sign up. If you've already signed up and were sent an email yesterday, you should have received your tour time. See registration if you haven't received that email. Also, if you're going to the Museum of Pop Culture Wednesday night, you must take your badge with you. That's your admittance to the monorail. And if you're taking a guest, they must also have a badge. So if you have any questions, make sure to see Jennifer or Tanya out front. If you're planning a chapter meeting for tonight, please let the registration desk know so they can create a schedule. And our next concurrent session begins at 2:45, and we were just talking about rural broadband. The 2:45 session is Bridging the Digital Divide. So thank you for attending.